In 1992, a farmer in Longyou County draining a local pond to clear silt struck carved stone 3 meters below the waterline. Within weeks, local authorities pumped the chamber dry and descended with flashlights into a space that should not have existed. The ceiling rose more than 30 meters overhead. Carved pillars held no visible load. The walls bore systematic chisel marks running in parallel bands across granite that pre-modern tools were not supposed to penetrate at that scale. Textbooks recorded no major construction projects in this region during the Han Dynasty. The historical record mentioned no quarries, no imperial tombs, no monumental works of any kind in Zhejiang Province from the period the initial carbon samples suggested. Then structural engineers measured the angles and load distribution across the spans, and the numbers did not match anything the ancient world was believed capable of producing without modern steel. The site was dated through a combination of methods. Radiocarbon analysis of organic material recovered from sediment layers within the chambers suggested construction during the late Warring States period or early Han Dynasty, placing the work somewhere between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century AD. Stylistic analysis of the chisel marks and the geometric patterns carved into a small number of decorative panels supported this range. The Han Dynasty, which ruled China from 206 BC to 220 AD, was known for monumental construction projects, including sections of the Great Wall, imperial tombs, and large-scale irrigation works. The initial scholarly interpretation of the Longyou Caves followed this template. The chambers were assumed to be an imperial quarry, a site where stone had been extracted for use in regional construction projects, or possibly an unfinished tomb complex intended for a high-ranking official whose identity had been lost to the historical record. Both explanations had precedent. Quarrying operations from the Han period had been documented elsewhere in China, and the practice of carving subterranean tomb chambers directly into bedrock was well established. The problem was scale. The volume of rock removed from the Longyou site approached 1 million cubic meters. For comparison, the Great Pyramid of Giza contains roughly 2.6 million cubic meters of stone, but that stone was quarried, transported, and assembled above ground over a period of decades, using a labor force estimated in the tens of thousands. The Longyou chambers represented the removal of nearly half that volume from a single location, carved in situ, with the extracted material transported elsewhere and leaving no archaeological trace. No contemporary Han Dynasty project of comparable scale had been documented in Zhejiang Province. The regional historical records, which are extensive for the period, make no mention of a quarry, a tomb, or any major construction effort in Longyou County. The Book of Han, the official dynastic history compiled in the 1st century AD, records imperial projects across the empire in considerable detail. Longyou does not appear. The chambers themselves showed features that did not align with the quarry hypothesis. In a typical quarry, stone is extracted in blocks, and the resulting space reflects the geometry of removal. Walls are irregular, ceilings follow the natural fracture planes of the rock, and pillars, if left standing at all, are positioned to prevent immediate collapse rather than to support long-term structural loads. The Longyou chambers showed none of this. The walls were smooth and vertical. The ceilings followed consistent curves across spans exceeding 20 meters. Pillars had been left standing at regular intervals, and the spacing of these pillars suggested intentional load distribution rather than expedient support. The tool marks, visible across every surface, ran in parallel bands, indicating a systematic carving technique applied uniformly across the entire site. There was no variation in method from one chamber to the next, no evidence of trial and error, no corrective work where a carving team had misjudged an angle or encountered an unexpected flaw in the stone. The tomb hypothesis faced similar difficulties. Han Dynasty tombs, even those constructed for emperors, rarely exceeded a few hundred square meters in total interior space. The tombs were designed to house the deceased, grave goods, and in some cases attendants or family members, but they were not intended as inhabitable spaces. The Longyou chambers, by contrast, offered thousands of square meters of open floor area with ceilings high enough to accommodate multi-story structures. No human remains had been recovered from any of the chambers. No grave goods, no inscriptions, no offerings, no evidence of funerary use. The decorative carving that did exist was minimal, limited to a few geometric patterns and stylized representations of fish, horses, and birds on isolated panels. The iconography carried no obvious religious or political symbolism, and it occupied less than 1% of the total carved surface area. If these chambers had been intended as tombs, they had never been used for that purpose, and the effort invested in their creation far exceeded anything the tomb function would require. By the mid-1990s, researchers working at the site had acknowledged that the orthodox explanations did not fit the evidence. The chambers were too large, too precisely carved, and too systematically organized to be a simple quarry. They lacked the features that would mark them as tombs, and the historical record, which should have documented a project of this scale, contained no mention of it. The Longyou Caves had been built by a society capable of quarrying and transporting 1 million cubic meters of granite, and that society had left no record of why. The engineering analysis that would reframe the Longyou Caves began in earnest in the early 2000s, when structural engineers and geologists from Chinese research institutions gained access to the site with modern surveying equipment. The initial archaeological surveys had documented the dimensions and layout of the chambers, but they had not attempted to quantify the precision of the carving or to model the structural loads that the carved pillars and ceilings were bearing. When laser scanning and photogrammetry were applied to the site, the data returned a picture that did not match the capabilities attributed to Han Dynasty engineering in the existing literature. The pillars, which had appeared roughly cylindrical during visual inspection, were revealed to deviate from true vertical by less than 1 degree across heights exceeding 10 meters. The ceiling curvature, which had been assumed to follow the natural contours of the bedrock, was shown to follow a consistent geometric arc across multiple chambers, suggesting intentional design rather than adaptive carving. The structural implications of these measurements were specific. A chamber with a floor area of 2,000 square meters and a ceiling height of 30 meters, carved entirely from granite, places enormous compressive and tensile loads on any pillars left standing within the space. Granite is strong in compression but prone to fracture under uneven loading, and any error in pillar placement or angle would concentrate stress along fracture planes, leading to progressive failure over centuries. The Longyou pillars had been standing for more than 2,000 years without visible cracking, subsidence, or deformation. Modern structural analysis, conducted by engineers at Zhejiang University and published in Chinese engineering journals in the mid-2000s, calculated the load paths through the pillars and found that the spacing and positioning distributed the ceiling weight almost optimally. The placement was not random. It was not the result of carving around convenient outcroppings of harder stone. The pillars had been positioned before carving began, in locations that would maximize structural stability across spans that no Han Dynasty engineer was supposed to understand, without the mathematical frameworks developed in Europe during the Renaissance. The volume of material removed posed a separate problem. 1 million cubic meters of granite weighs approximately 2.7 million metric tons. Removing that mass from a depth of 30 meters below the surface, transporting it to the surface, and then moving it elsewhere without leaving any trace in the archaeological record required a logistics operation that exceeded the scale of most documented Han Dynasty projects. The stone had not been used to build any known structure in the region. No Han-era buildings, walls, or monuments in Zhejiang Province show evidence of sourcing material from Longyou. The extracted rock had either been transported hundreds of kilometers away, which would have required infrastructure and labor beyond anything the historical record supports, or it had been disposed of in a manner that left no detectable archaeological signature. Neither option fit comfortably within the orthodox framework. The tool marks, examined under magnification, added another layer of complexity. The marks ran in parallel bands across the walls and ceilings, with consistent depth and spacing, suggesting the use of a repeated carving technique applied by multiple teams working in coordination. The width of the individual chisel strikes indicated tools of uniform size, and the depth of penetration into the granite suggested either exceptional hardness in the tool material or a mechanical advantage that simple hand tools would not provide. Bronze tools, which were standard during the Han Dynasty, are softer than granite and wear down rapidly when used for carving. Iron tools, which became more common during the later Han period, are harder but still require frequent resharpening and replacement when used against granite over extended periods. The scale of the Longyou project would have required thousands of tools and constant resupply, yet no tool caches, no forge sites, no evidence of metallurgical activity associated with the carving effort had been found in the surrounding area. The ventilation and lighting problem remained unresolved. Carving a chamber 30 meters below the surface in solid rock requires breathable air and sufficient light for workers to see the surfaces they are carving. Natural ventilation through a single entrance shaft would be inadequate for a workspace of this size, particularly if dozens of workers were operating simultaneously and generating dust from the carving process. No evidence of deliberate ventilation shafts had been identified during the surveys, though it remains possible that such shafts existed and were later filled or collapsed. The lighting question was equally opaque. Oil lamps, torches, or candles would provide illumination, but they also consume oxygen and produce smoke, exacerbating the ventilation problem. The absence of soot deposits on the ceilings suggested either that the lighting method produced minimal smoke or that any soot had been removed or weathered away over 2 millennia. When the engineering data was presented at conferences and in published studies, the response from the broader archaeological community was cautious. The precision of the carving and the sophistication of the load distribution were acknowledged, but the absence of any historical documentation of the project left room for competing interpretations. Some researchers proposed that the chambers had been carved as an imperial storage facility for grain or military supplies, a function that would explain the large open spaces and the absence of decoration. The storage hypothesis addressed the scale problem but did not explain the precision, the pillar placement, or the absence of any record of such a facility in the imperial archives. Others suggested that the site had been a Taoist retreat, a sacred space carved into the earth for meditation and ritual practice. The Taoist interpretation drew on the tradition of mountain hermitages and cave temples in Chinese religious history, but it struggled to account for the sheer volume of labor required and the lack of religious iconography within the chambers. A third category of interpretation, less widely endorsed but persistently present in the literature, proposed that the Longyou Caves predated the Han Dynasty and had been constructed by an earlier and otherwise undocumented civilization in the region. Proponents of this view pointed to the absence of Han-era artifacts within the chambers and the lack of stylistic parallels to known Han Dynasty construction projects. The pre-Han hypothesis faced immediate difficulties with the radiocarbon dating, which consistently placed organic material in the chambers within the late Warring States to early Han range, and with the tool marks, which resembled techniques documented from the Han period more closely than from any earlier era. The hypothesis also required the existence of a society with engineering capabilities exceeding those of the Han Dynasty, operating in a region where no other evidence of such a society had been found. The chambers could now be measured. The precision could be documented. The load paths could be modeled. What remained inaccessible was intent, and intent, in the absence of written records or clear functional artifacts, could not be inferred from stone alone. The engineering sophistication of the Longyou Caves had been documented. The structural analysis had confirmed what visual inspection had suggested. The pillars were not expedient supports left standing during a crude extraction process. They were load-bearing elements positioned with an understanding of force distribution that the textbooks did not attribute to Han Dynasty builders. The ceiling curves were not random. They followed geometric principles that minimized stress concentrations across spans that would challenge modern engineers working without steel reinforcement. The tool marks were not the irregular traces of trial and error. They were the systematic output of a coordinated labor force working to a plan that no one had written down, or if they had, no copy had survived the 20 centuries that followed. What the engineering could not answer was why. Why this location? Why this scale? Why the absence of any record? The historical silence surrounding the Longyou Caves is one of the most striking features of the site. The Han Dynasty maintained extensive administrative records, and the imperial archives documented construction projects, resource allocation, labor conscription, and regional governance in considerable detail. Projects of far smaller scale than Longyou appear in these records. The construction of local roads, the repair of irrigation channels, the establishment of grain storage facilities, all were recorded and archived. A project requiring the removal of 1 million cubic meters of granite, the coordination of what must have been thousands of workers over years or decades, and the logistical infrastructure to supply, house, and manage that labor force should have left a documentary trace. It did not. No Han Dynasty text mentions Longyou as a site of imperial construction. No local histories compiled in the centuries following the Han collapse reference the chambers. The oral traditions of the region, recorded by ethnographers and historians in the modern period, contain no folklore about ancient excavations or lost builders. The caves entered the historical record in 1992, when a farmer drained a pond. The absence extends beyond written records. Archaeological surveys of the area surrounding the caves have found no evidence of a settlement large enough to support a construction project of this scale. No worker housing, no tool caches, no forge sites, no middens containing food waste or broken ceramics that would indicate sustained occupation by a large labor force. The stone removed from the chambers, 2.7 million metric tons of granite, has not been located. It was not used in local construction. It does not appear in the archaeological record of any known Han Dynasty site within reasonable transport distance. The most parsimonious explanation is that it was broken into smaller pieces and dispersed, but that explanation raises the question of why anyone would invest the labor required to remove and disperse such a volume of material without using it for construction. Each of the competing theories that emerged in the decades following the discovery attempts to resolve part of this puzzle, but none resolves all of it. The imperial storage hypothesis explains the large open spaces and the absence of decoration. Grain storage facilities in the Han Dynasty were often austere, functional structures, and underground storage would have provided natural climate control and protection from fire. The hypothesis struggles with the precision. A grain storage facility does not require pillars positioned to within 1 degree of vertical. It does not require ceiling curves calculated to distribute load optimally. It does not require the removal of 1 million cubic meters of rock when a fraction of that volume would suffice for storage capacity. The hypothesis also does not explain the absence of any record of such a facility in the imperial archives, which meticulously documented grain storage as a matter of famine prevention and tax administration. The Taoist retreat hypothesis draws on the tradition of sacred mountain caves in Chinese religious practice, spaces carved or adapted for meditation, ritual, and withdrawal from the material world. Taoism, which developed during the Warring States period and flourished during the Han Dynasty, emphasized harmony with natural forces and often associated spiritual practice with remote or subterranean locations. The hypothesis accounts for the effort invested in creating a space removed from the surface world and for the minimal decoration, which could reflect an aesthetic of simplicity. It does not account for the scale. Taoist retreats documented from the Han period and later were typically small, accommodating a single hermit or a small community of practitioners. The Longyou chambers could house hundreds. The hypothesis also does not explain the systematic engineering. Spiritual practice does not require load-optimized pillar placement. The absence of religious iconography, which is present in nearly every documented Taoist cave site from later periods, further weakens the interpretation. The pre-Han hypothesis, which proposes that the chambers were constructed by an earlier and otherwise unknown civilization, attempts to sidestep the documentary silence by placing the construction before the period of systematic record-keeping. The hypothesis faces the radiocarbon data, which consistently dates organic material within the chambers to the late Warring States or early Han period, and the stylistic analysis of the tool marks, which resemble Han-era techniques. Proponents of the hypothesis have suggested that the radiocarbon dates reflect later occupation or use of the chambers rather than original construction, but no evidence of earlier construction phases or older tool marks has been identified. The hypothesis also requires the existence of a society with engineering capabilities exceeding those of the Han Dynasty, operating in a region where no other trace of such a society has been found. The explanatory burden is high. A fourth interpretation proposed by researchers examining potential astronomical alignments has suggested that the chambers may have been oriented to celestial events or used for observations related to calendar keeping or agricultural timing. Some of the chamber entrances face directions that align with solstice sunrise angles, and the regularity of the pillar spacing has been interpreted by a small number of researchers as encoding numerical relationships related to lunar or solar cycles. The astronomical hypothesis is the least developed of the major interpretations and has not gained widespread support. It does not explain the volume of rock removed, the absence of observational instruments or inscriptions, or the lack of any documented tradition of subterranean astronomical observation in Han Dynasty China. The construction method remains a subject of active debate. The standard interpretation holds that the chambers were carved by teams working inward from the entrance, removing rock in horizontal layers and leaving pillars standing at intervals to support the developing ceiling. This method is consistent with the tool marks and with documented stoneworking techniques from the period. It does not fully explain how the pillars were positioned with such precision before the surrounding rock was removed, or how the ceiling curves were planned and executed without visible errors across spans of 20 meters. Modern engineers attempting to reconstruct the process have noted that achieving the observed precision would require either a detailed three-dimensional plan, which no evidence suggests existed, or a level of real-time geometric calculation during the carving process that exceeds the mathematical tools attributed to Han Dynasty builders. Neither option fits comfortably within the existing framework. The question of abandonment is equally opaque. The chambers show no signs of collapse, flooding, or structural failure that would have forced workers to halt construction. No tools were left in place. No partially carved surfaces suggest an abrupt cessation of work. The chambers as they exist today appear finished, though whether they were finished according to an original plan or simply stopped at a point where further carving was no longer pursued cannot be determined. If the site had served a function, that function ended without leaving trace. If it had been part of a larger project, The other parts of that project have not been found. Modern archaeology operates within limits. The structure can be measured. The rock type can be identified. The tool marks can be analyzed. The age can be estimated within a range. The load paths can be modeled. What cannot be recovered in the absence of written records or functional artifacts is the intent of the builders. The Longyou Caves stand as a testament to engineering capability, but the purpose that drove that capability remains inaccessible. Researchers working at the site have acknowledged this openly. The chambers were not a crude quarry. They were not a simple tomb. They were a project of enormous scale, executed with precision that modern analysis can document but not fully explain, and then abandoned or completed in silence. The stone remains. The record does not. Both facts are part of the story, and the story, as it exists in the present, accommodates both the knowledge that the engineering provides and the uncertainty that the silence imposes. The Longyou Caves were built. They were built with sophistication that exceeded expectations. They were built by people whose names are not known, for reasons that were not recorded, using methods that left no blueprint. The chambers still stand beneath Zhejiang Province, carved into bedrock 20 centuries ago, engineered with a precision that the textbooks said should not exist, and waiting for questions that may never be answered.